I think there's ways in which I've defined life as on the banks. To get into the river would be, in a sense, losing my life, but there's actually something that awakens in me, and I begin to see I was actually made to be in the river.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Restoring the Soul podcast. It's another episode, and today I am talking with my colleague at Restoring the Soul, Brian Boecker. Hey Brian.
Hey Michael.
So as we were talking about some of the content that I want you to share today, the topic was really, how do we as counselors, but also how do people identify exactly what's behind their stuckness? Most people that go to counseling are stuck somewhere. They're not where they want to be, or they're in a place they don't want to be. And we help people get unstuck. So I want you to introduce this topic. We'll unpack it a little bit, but why don't you just jump in with What's on your heart?
Yeah, I think I've been really blessed. I think Kurt Thompson, probably love his work and the things he's brought to the conversation. And then that introduced me to his friend, Dan Siegel. And I just love Dan's work and kind of how it's just brought a whole different flavor and taste to therapy, as well as to mental health issues. And he has this concept, and he calls it the river of integration, and he talks about it, and it's really helpful just in identifying maybe some stuck places, both within me, but also in relationships, but also in kind of family, even systems, and what's going on there. So he refers to this river of integration. He says all mental health is kind of like the flow of this river. And I think he talks about it being an embodied and relational flow of energy that really defines kind of our mental health and well-being. And that river is kind of bounded by two banks. That bank on one side is the bank of rigidity. The second is the bank of chaos. And he describes that river as flowing, and it's when it flows, it's like what creates harmony and this concept of even flow that we've heard around from different authors. But it's that sense of, I think it's an expansive, it's a well-being. He uses these 5 words to describe that river. He says it's the acrostic phases, right? It's flexible, adaptable, coherent, energized, and stable. And so when you're in that flow, that's where you're kind of like optimizing your self-organization and your relation, both self-organization with yourself, but also with others and in relationship. He would say when that river's blocked, or if there's anything that disrupts that harmony, it usually sends you to the one of two directions, either towards a sense of rigidity or a sense of chaos. Again, Dan's a brilliant man. These things actually, those ideas or words even come out of a deep study of math, which it's like, I know how to use math. I don't understand it when people start talking on that level of it, but it's really helpful to me to see that, right? These ideas of rigidity, of I need order and control. I need predictability. On the other side of chaos is life is just pure random. It's kind of every man for himself kind of feel to it. I think that's been helpful for me to see, like, I think in my family system growing up, my parents probably were more on the rigid side of things. My dad was a scientist, brilliant. He was always a measure twice, cut once, and sometimes wasn't quite sure if he wanted to cut. He might throw in another measure just to be sure. I was probably on the other side. Probably I brought more chaos to our family system, and they weren't always quite sure what to do with me. But I think what that left me with is I'm chaotic. The solution to my life is probably over on the other side of the bank, which is rigidity. And so there was always this sense of like, I'm kind of chaotic. I got to get more rigid or structured to actually solve my problem. I think that always left me in some ways like I can never measure up to my dad's perfection. I can never measure up to his precision, his ability to do things. And so I think one of the greatest gifts my dad gave me in his later years was he began to name some of the fears that drove his perfection, right? And that just goes, oh, I can relate to that. that feels like, oh, we're actually feeling and experiencing some of the same things. The way we've gone about handling it has been very different. That felt like a connectivity that moved us both in some ways towards the river kind of integration in that way. And so I think the other piece is I think those polarizations have felt really true in my life, especially in my Christian journey, right? I think rigidity or structure, getting it right, real emphasis on truth and kind of the structure has been really strong. And that's always the solution to any chaos or struggle that you're facing, right? And it's been really true that it's felt like, oh, I can actually move towards this river where Siegel uses this idea that we pendulate between the two banks, that we need elements of both banks to have this structure in our life, but also the surprise of the randomness or the unexpected. And both those pieces are needed to bring kind of the joy and the energy that we kind of are looking for in our life in that way. And so I think it's been really helpful for me to see that personally in my own kind of inside of me, different parts of me that's related to. I think it's been really helpful to see that in my family of origin. I think it's helpful to think of that in relationship with other people, that we might get stuck in one of these banks and how we both actually move into more the river together with that.
Wow. That was an amazing summary. The first time that I heard about the river of integration and the rigidity and the chaos was from you. I had read Siegel's material and just really skimmed over that. I've heard podcasts. Actually, one of them was with Kurt and Dan together.
Yeah.
But when you unpacked it for me the first time, I just thought this is really important. And the thing I love about it is just like interpersonal neurobiology itself, which Kurt and Dan both live and move and write about. Yeah. It's a kind of meta theory where it's a big way of understanding our sense of self in relation to where we're stuck, but it also is extremely practical, and you can bring it down to the specific level. It's almost like all forms of disorder, psychopathology, and struggle, from addiction to anxiety, depression, compulsiveness, that they can fit into, or it's a back and forth between the rigidity, which is about control and having power, not being vulnerable. And then on the other side, the chaos, which is all about I'm vulnerability. There is no structure. There are no boundaries. And I'm really helpless to engage with and control my own life. Yeah. So great words and description to the stuckness and the points of pain. Yeah. Talk a little bit more about the river, because one of the reasons why this was compelling to me is the river is, of course, a Judeo-Christian image. You've got Jesus in John chapter 7 at a Jewish religious festival where he stands up and he says, streams of living water will flow from within us. And the contingency there is that we have to acknowledge that we're thirsty, to acknowledge that there's something more that we want. And in some ways, to acknowledge that we're caught up in the rigidity or the chaos, and that we want to be in the river. The other one, of course, is in all throughout the Old Testament, but in Psalm 46, where it says, be still and know that I'm God. That whole psalm is a psalm and a picture of chaos happening, where the psalmist talks about the rivers melting into the sea and the earth quaking. And then this invitation is to be still and know that I'm God. But it's after the psalmist says that there is a river who makes glad the city of God. Yeah. And its reference is Jerusalem, and Jerusalem, geographically speaking, has no river. So this river is an internal river. It's the river of the life of God. And the invitation is in the midst of the chaos, be still. It's like saying, with rigidity or chaos, jump in the river and just float. Yeah. That's kind of the image that I get. So how do we, you and I, because, we always try to preach to ourselves first before we preach to others, but how do we help people get into the river, into this place where there's the faces, the flexible, the adaptable, the coherence, the stability, and the energy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I remember a number of years ago, right, for me, this song by Stephen Curtis Chapman, I think is called Dive, right? And he's talking about diving into the river, and it's just like, oh, take it where it wants to go, right? Like it's this sense of, and I think that spoke to me. There's something about my movement, again, as an Enneagram 9, is like, I have to step up and in, right? I have to kind of dive into the river, take that risk that I'm not in control and I don't know where this is necessarily going to go. And I think sometimes that's the pull for me, right? Is I'm not sure where this is going to go. It feels a little bit chaotic, and I'm not in control of it. And so I think there's a sense, especially with rigidity, and I would say this is true for our false selves. Our false selves clamor for control and certainty. And I think the river invites us to, you need to let go of that, and be willing to kind of jump in or dive into that. Again, I feel like I jump banks. If I'm over on the chaos side, I see rigidity as a solution, right? If I'm in a really rigid place, then it's like, well, just let go and just do whatever, and It's like both of those have elements of what's true. But again, there's this pendulating back and forth that I'm receiving the coherence or the structure that I need, but I'm also going back and forth between those two kind of elements in that. I think to go to your illustration, right, it really hit me as I was kind of unpacking this, right? The prodigal son story really contains all these elements, right? The younger son being the chaotic part, the older brother being the rigid part, the father being really the place of integration and wanting to draw both of them into the party. And I think that's a really helpful imagery for me, is that God's not on the banks, he's in the river. He's inviting me into that, and it's going to look full of truth. It's going to be full of grace, and it's going to be without condemnation. And that feels like it adds another depth to me, that when I feel that voice of condemnation, when I feel like I'm just being pounded with truth, like with those internal voices, that I'm not really in the place of the river, right? Like there's a place of that gentleness, that kindness, that playfulness and caring of God, right? But it's also structured. It's like there's things to be done in a certain way, right? Like that he invites me into that. And I feel like that is a really helpful, in terms of a healing image of God, right? Like that God is in the river and he's inviting me, in a sense, to come and play in that.
I love the way that you integrated that story of the prodigal son and those characters and how it kind of brings Siegel's whole model together. That's really rich. And I'll definitely be pondering that and meditating on that. It strikes me that the chaos on one bank and the rigidity on the other bank are not just physiological reactions, although that's part of it, but they're ways of actually avoiding the surrender and the trust and the vulnerability of being in the river. So they're coping strategies, and they may not be consciously chosen, but to be in the river, if we're talking to a Christian audience and followers of Jesus that are stuck and struggling, and if we just say, hey, Jesus is the river, God is the river, jump in the river, that is the answer, but there's reasons why we don't. It's really vulnerable to trust that we're loved, that we're welcome, that there's grace, that we can be seen in those places. And then the other thing, and I'm kind of developing this in my mind as we're talking, and that's how we both process, is like, oh, here's clarity just as we're talking. Every riverbank I've ever been in, by virtue of being a bank, is higher than the flat level of the water. Otherwise, the water would spill over the banks. And so there's a sense where if I'm up on the bank of rigidity, or I'm up on the bank of chaos, that I have to descend, that I have to go down, and not just to be next to the water or even on the water, but to go into the water. And that makes me think of this classic analogy of the iceberg, that the minute we go below the water line, we're going into what Larry Crabb used to call the line of pain. And going down into the water is the pain that we're trying to avoid or control or manage. As Jesus talked about in so many ways, it's when we lose our life that we find it. that we
Yeah.
find our life by losing it. So stepping into the pain and going down into the river, we're actually discovering something, the embrace, the grace, the welcome, the sufficiency of God. And then to use attachment language, it's there that we can be seen, soothed, safe, and secure.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that, Michael, because I think your words are true, right? Like, I think there's ways in which I've defined life as on the banks. To get into the river would be, in a sense, losing my life, but there's actually something that awakens in me, and I begin to see I was actually made to be in the river, and that
Right.
becomes a very different experience of that world. I think the other thing that really stands out to me is that in the river is really true and God-honoring desire, right? I think to the banks, there's either a deadness. I think these are Dan Allender categories, right? There's either deadness or there's demand, right? Like I must either have this or I'm going to just die to it. And I think in the river, somehow that desire finds its fulfillment in a way that it was designed to be, or I begin to taste it in ways that I fulfill it. I think in this earth, we don't have that fulfillment that we all long for, but we get tastes of it along the way that begins to say, oh, this is what I've wanted. This is what I've been longing for. And I think that's the imagery of thirsting. Do you know what I mean? And the entering into the river is kind of attending to that thirst.
Yeah. The other big image that comes to my mind, and this is obviously very different from where we started, but baptism. And throughout the scriptures and in ancient traditions, they didn't just have a little fount with a small pitcher where they would pour water on somebody's head, or they didn't have at the back of the altar, a place where people would get dunked. It was in a river. And we know that in the scriptures that with John the Baptist, that he was in the Jordan River and baptizing people there. And I'm really jumping around here, but one of my favorite movies from about 25 years ago, Angelina Jolie, John Cusack, and Billy Bob Thornton. And the movie was called Pushing Tin. And Billy Bob Thornton and John Cusack are air traffic controllers. And there's infidelity that's involved. But the pushing tin are the airplanes that are up in the sky. And so there's a moment where Billy Bob Thornton confronts John Cusack for being a bad husband and for being pathetic. And they're out in the woods, and he's yelling at him in this secular kind of sermonic hellfire brimstone way to jump in the river and to cleanse yourself from your sins. And because it's secular, it was obvious that the point was not that you're sinful and you need to be cleansed, but you need a new beginning. And the river is the place to not be on this bank of, in the case of the movie, his chaos was he was unfaithful to his wife. The rigidity was that he was trying to be a good guy, and the one place he could feel competent was going to work and being a hero by keeping all the planes in the sky. Yeah. So this image of the river, it's the place of life. It's the place of, as you said, flow and energy, but it's also a place of rest. Because of the flow, it's a place where we don't have to strive. It's a place where we don't have to stay in control or maintain control, nor do we have to experience the consequences and oftentimes the victimization of being in a place of chaos and powerlessness. Yeah. A friend of mine taught NFL players how to swim. And she was a swim instructor, but she just developed this reputation for adults who never learned how to swim. So these NFL players would be very ashamed, right? They're successful, they're handsome, they've got money, and like they can't swim. And so she worked with them, and she said the hardest thing to teach them was to float. You know, you can sink, you can kick really hard with your legs and exhaust yourself and stay above, but you ultimately need to learn how to float to swim. Yeah. And it feels like the river is in the ultimate picture of release and rest and relinquishment and surrender, and therefore freedom is in floating. Yeah. And that's the invitation of the river. Yeah. Come all You who are weary, and I will give you rest.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that imagery, and I think that's a good imagery. I think the further you go out on the banks, the more striving and violent you get, right? And so I think both of the banks actually join together probably in a place of violence. Do you know what I mean? The more rigid you are, the more you have to get control and demand that you keep it. More chaotic you get, the more, again, I think they almost join in that place of violence, because chaos ultimately leads probably to rigidity, and rigidity ultimately leads to chaos. But I think that picture of the river is I get to actually rest into, and I think floating is a great word because you're actually being held by the water, and it goes back to that attachment. And that's where Siegel also uses this word for integration, right? That river is a place of the linkage of differentiated parts, right? And so there's ways in which I become more whole. All the different parts of me become whole. But I think also too, relationships, differentiated parts become linked and connected. They become whole in that without losing that sense of uniqueness. In that.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think a lot of people may be listening to this and going, wow, this is interesting, which it is. This sounds really helpful. So now I've got to get in the river. But the problem is, if we think about the river as the streams of water, the river of God, union with him, all the rest and grace that comes with that. One of the things we frequently talk about on the podcast and at Restoring the Soul is that the reason why we struggle spiritually to be loved, to be embraced, and to be held, if you will, to float and to allow the water to be beneath us and to do its work, is because of the wounds inside of us and the disintegration. So if I'm in a place of great rigidity, whether that's anxiety or OCD or workaholism or porn addiction, if I just go, okay, today, on the count of 3, I'm going to jump in the river and trust God, and I'm not going to do this anymore. The reason why that fails again and again and again is that here's what I want you to comment on. We really need to develop an apparatus, a neurological apparatus to be able to do that, a emotional capacity to regulate, a spiritual growing sense of ability to trust love, that people just can't go from I've never been vulnerable and out of control to suddenly I am able to tolerate vulnerability and be out of control.
Yeah.
Comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great word. I feel like the movement is, how am I moving towards the river?
Right.
I think there's experiences of being in the river, and then there's kind of like this iterating back and forth into it. And again, this is my own journey, right? Like I feel like I'm heading towards the river, and I feel like that journey to me feels like the experiences of being held by others, the experiences of experiencing the river in relationship to other people, right? Them offering me those characteristics of, truth with grace, with no condemnation, right? And so I think, again, Siegel says it well. It's an embodied and it's a relational place that we're going to. And I think that's where it's really important that I'm developing and I'm choosing to enter into experiences where I experience that within myself, but also with other people. And so I'm beginning to open up that spaciousness within myself, to be attentive to that self, but I'm also receiving that from other people. Right. Again, this past weekend, I had a project that I needed to do at home that's been hanging over my head for like 2 years. Right. And I've just thought about it. I've taken little steps in it, but I've just felt stuck. And I reached out to a number of my good friends and I just asked them, I go, hey, would you guys mind coming over Saturday and just help me to do this project? Because it just feels overwhelming. It feels chaotic to me. And I'm not quite sure how to even get into it. And I think just the presence of their relationship with me, just them willing to do that, willing to sacrifice to be with me in it, And I think that word with is probably one of the most important words. Is I need others to be with me, to walk me to the river. And I think as we did that, I began to see, oh, there's movement. There's that sense of agency that's coming back, and it feels alive. It doesn't feel like I'm trapped by it, right? And I think for me, again, agency is probably a big word. And I think that came via that relationship with other people to join me in that. And I think I just tasted, again, a sense of like, this is a taste of the river, right? I'm not alone. I don't have to come up with this all by myself. I've got friends that care about me. And I think probably the most helpful thing was just telling them I'm overwhelmed. It's not just that I want, people to come help me do a project. It's I'm overwhelmed and I kind of need you to join me in this, to helping me move in a way that allows me to engage in a more wholehearted, full way.
Yeah, your vulnerability wasn't that you didn't know how to do the project or couldn't get unstuck. Your vulnerability was that you didn't want to acknowledge that you needed other people. And first of all, I really appreciate you sharing that. And second of all, I can totally relate to that. During the same weekend, I had my friend Kyle, who flew here from Orlando. And during a stressful time, he just said, I just want to be a good friend. And we did projects all weekend long. And it was fun. And I got things done. But I felt so much peace and I felt loved. Why do you think it is that, especially for Christians, we cling to this idea? It's a true idea, but God is enough, God is enough, God is enough. I just need God to help me get into the river. Versus, I need to call up friends and say, help, I'm struggling, I need you. And that is as spiritual and profound an act of worship as saying, okay, God, on the count of 3, I need you to strengthen me to walk down to the river.
Yeah, I think again, this might be our own cultural bias, right? We're located in a culture that very much, it's individual, it's bootstrapping, it's I should be able to overcome this. And again, that's never been the narrative that God has for us, right? There's this sense, right? And this is what I love about, the feeding of the 5,000 is another story that just, it's really meant a lot to me the last couple of years, right? Is I think it's in John where it says, Jesus asked them to feed the 5,000 and the disciples, one of them goes, send them away, make them get their own food. Another disciple says, if we worked for like 2 years, right, we would never make them enough money even then to feed everybody. And then Andrew brings up and goes, hey, there's this little boy here, little lad that has his lunch, right? But what's that among so many? And again, they're all kind of in that sense of like they're looking at it from a very different perspective. Yet this boy came, and again, it feels like the child, right? He's like, you could probably picture him. He's like, hey, I got a lunch, I'll share, right? And everybody's like, don't be so ridiculous, right? This is 5,000 people. You got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And so the reality of that story is, again, we go, Jesus fed the 5,000. I would say that little boy fed the 5,000 because he risked offering what he had. He brought his poverty to Jesus, and Jesus multiplied it and took what he had to offer. And I think that same kind of movement is in me is, can I bring my poverty? Can I bring it and then bring it to the whole? And I think that's where, again, community is. Hey, we all bring what we have to offer, and we offer that to each other. And in that, God multiplies and does things. And so I think the idea of, again, individuality versus community and relationship. And I think, again, that's where Siegel would say the shaping of this, building of this is very much a relational activity. It's an embodied activity. And that's, again, something I need to learn to pay attention to. What's going on in my body in regard to that, but also what's going on in my relationships with that as much as it is what's going on in my journey with that.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.